Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of March 1st, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. We are back today from an extended winter weather and power outage hiatus, so thanks to all our crew in the College of Liberal Arts Development Studio at UT Austin for helping us get back online today. Today I'm joined again by Josh Blank, Research Director for the same Texas Politics Project. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me back. Glad to be out of the winter weather.
Yeah, looking out of my window, it is very nice out there. So today, what we're going to start with anyway, and probably spend a lot of time with, is to do something of a breaking news podcast. We're recording this mere minutes after Governor Greg Abbott made a series of announcements in Lubbock, Texas, on shifts in the state's COVID policy. I mean, this was no secret. There had been trial balloons galore going into last week about this. And the governor announced that he was going to open up Texas, that Texas would be 100% open next week. We're recording this Tuesday afternoon. He said that that the state will be open for business, that all statewide mandates and executive orders setting, capacity levels or closures would be rescinded by that in that executive order. So Texas would be, quote unquote, 100% open. And then in the perhaps more symbolic realm to a lot of people, he also said that he would be ending the statewide mask mandate. And the messaging was pretty interesting in the sense that he was, as he has done through much of this, trying pretty hard to not tell people everything was okay. And so the way that he did that today was to say that removing state mandates does not end personal responsibility. And there were some fallbacks that if the hospitals rise above, I believe he said, Josh, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is basically notes from the speech, that if the hospitals rose above 15% of occupancy attributed to COVID, that county judges could engage in what would be limited mitigation efforts.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, close. Let's say 15% for a week,
right?
And then in the hospital regions that have defined the closures,
right?
So yeah, and then actually, no. And I was just that county judges can't just use the mitigation standards; they can apply to be allowed to actually use the mitigations. So it's a little bit different, but yes.
Well, yeah, and that's good. So the overlay here, of course, is not allowing what many Republicans, including the governor at times, have considered overreaching, if not, to coin a phrase, tyrannical local authorities from running roughshod over people's rights in the name of public health. So, in the initial speech, not much about schools and teachers. In an interview shortly after on site with Chad Hasty, become kind of the go-to guy for Republican radio interviews. Hats off to him. He's got a lot of good stuff. It's become a good outlet. They said that would be mainly up to TEA, and we'd be hearing the Texas Education Administration.
Right. And that was basically
and we'd be hearing more about that.
And that was basically the answer across some of those areas. So what about schools? So, TEA is going to say, what about prisons? It's like, well, we have TCDJ and so on and so forth. So that is a little bit of the answer here.
Right. The response that we're getting, and we'll talk about that, has been predictable so far, I think, at least in the last, half hour or so. I'm watching Twitter and seeing what the Twitter group, what the Twitter crowd is saying on both sides of the ideological aisle. The other news tie-in for us here is that we're in the midst of releasing the February UT Texas Tribune poll, in which we once again did a big battery of COVID-19 questions, our fourth poll over the course of the pandemic, looking at at attitudes, Texans' attitudes on the pandemic. And so we've got a lot to kind of bring to bear here. So I'm wondering, Josh, I mean, what do you think? What kind of struck? Let's put it this way: what kind of struck you in terms of the context, the public opinion context of all this, at least at first cut?
Well, I don't want to say I'm having trouble characterizing the public opinion response. That's not really it. It's I think deciding what aspect of the public opinion response to characterize is sort of the difficult part here. And so I think there's sort of two ways that I'm inclined to look at this, right? And one is to say, we've been measuring attitudes towards COVID since April. This will be our fourth time measuring attitudes, specifically towards different aspects of COVID and people's lives during it. And, one aspect of this is to say, boy, people are still pretty concerned about this. People are still living their lives differently. They're still, taking a lot of precautions. I mean, speaking of mask mandates, I mean, that, the mask wearing, was treated as though it was some kind of big political symbol. But, we know from our polling here in Texas that, basically after April, 4 in 5 Republicans were wearing masks.
Right.
And almost 100% of Democrats. So that's not to say there's not a difference there, but ultimately, it's not as though most Republicans are running around maskless. And that's the flip side of this, it's not clear to me that, most Republicans are now going to throw their masks into a big bonfire and start celebrating, right? I think, there still is, there's still a certain, part, I think, of the adherence to the social distancing guidelines or mandates, former mandates that are honestly, I think people just doing what they know to keep them healthy. And I don't think that's necessarily going to change, I would say in a massive way immediately, but we'll see. We'll see. You want to comment? I mean, that's my one.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, you and I have talked a lot, and we've talked on the podcast before about, I don't want to be too Austin-centric in terms of thinking about what the social norms around mask wearing are going to be in the rest of the state. I mean, I seem to remember you driving, out of town.
I've driven around a couple of times.
When was that around? In the summer,
well,
right?
No, I'll tell you. No, I've done two trips. I did a trip. I did a trip up north. So I had north out of Austin, and and I think we were in and around, Waco. Very different. Approach to masks there. I did a trip in the summer down to Port Aransas, very different, rates of mask adherence there. So, for sure. But I also think that, at this point, I think the initial idea that this is some sort of, that mask wearing was a purely an expression of political ideology, number one, I think was always overstated. And I think the data has shown is consistently, not entirely the case. And so because of that, I only think that there's some share of Republicans, at this point, who are wearing masks because of the mandates. Because ultimately, even in April, when Republicans, quote unquote, weren't wearing masks, 69% of them were still wearing masks.
Yeah.
Even so even before it became, even if incorrectly characterized as a political expression, even before then, the vast majority of Republicans were wearing masks. So, I'm a little skeptical, but anyway, so, okay, but you're right. Point taken. So the one side is to say, hey, look, there's still a lot of people who are super concerned about this. One of the things I keep taking away from this is that, people on the whole don't necessarily seem to be feeling significantly safer now than compared to the last time that we polled. And to be clear, the last time we polled was in October, which is before vaccine distribution really got underway. And so a lot has changed, and technically has changed for the better, and yet people don't necessarily feel safer. I think, I saw something on Twitter, so I don't want to take credit for this, but it is I don't remember who said it, but it is an odd point to say, we're basically saying, hey, nobody needs masks anymore, but actually vaccines are only available to narrow slices of the population. Yeah. Which is an interesting policy statement, which again, we're not.
Well, and I think the governor was trying to, to get on top of that. The messaging in the governor's speech and that which he reiterated and expanded in the radio conversation immediately afterwards was to say that, vaccine distribution is going swimmingly in Texas. He focused on, what he presented as a high rate of vaccine in the oldest groups of Texans. He's singled out over 65 and over 80 as the
people. You mean the people who can get vaccines?
The demographic slice with the highest fatality rate. and also, promised that they would be, at the same time would be opening up the categories. And I think this is another interesting element that's not going to be the headline because it was also not elaborated. But he also said they would be changing the categories next week and broadening access to the vaccine at some point, and that announcement, the specifics of that would come later. So, I think the message is supposed to be that the combination of the vaccines, and there was discussion of how many people have already had it, and that this is going to be okay. And I do wonder a little bit if there's not going to be some interaction. I mean, more. I agree with you, and we've made this point repeatedly, and I think it's right that all things being equal, the difference between in mask wearing between Republicans and everyone else was never as huge as people presented, and never as symbolically inflammatory after a certain point as presented by people on both sides. I mean, look, there were Democrats, I think, that were, painting with too broad a brush about Republicans, but I think it's also fair to say, and some of this is anecdotal and some of it is looking at the other parts of the data that we have, that that a lot of the mask wearing was probably certainly somewhat begrudging, and a function of public health guidelines that made it more socially difficult to not wear a mask in public places. And that now, if the context of that shifts, I mean, again, you need to take another trip and we'll see. But even in Austin, it's become a little evident that there was uneven application of this. If you got in an even, semi-private setting.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so I don't know. So I'll just be interested to see, and we'll be able to poll again relatively soon, and we'll see. We'll ask again.
Right. So, so again, there's part of me that's kind of, a little bit perplexed given where we are and where the attitudes are. But then there's another part of me that's, almost, not surprised is almost not even the right way to put it. It's almost like it took so long, in that, we've been asking a series of questions over these polls, and the top line item that kind of gets at this is we ask people what's more important. Is it, is it, containing COVID, even if it hurts the economy, or is it more important to help the economy, even if it hurts efforts to contain COVID? The reality is, even though more Texans have been on the side of containing COVID than helping the economy throughout polling, the balance has been shifting more, over the last four polls towards, more toward the economy, even though COVID is still, more important to people. But among Republicans, supporting the economy has always been more important than containing the coronavirus. So this is in the polling. I'm not saying this is a general thing. This is on the survey item.
Sure.
And it's grown over time. And then, more to the point, really, we ask people, are you living your lives normal? Basically, what are you doing in response to COVID? Living your life normally, and then various levels of, restrictive movement and behavior beyond that. And the share of Republicans who are living their lives normally, throughout the crisis has continued to go up. Well, the share of Democrats who say the same has basically remained, below about, around 10% range.
Yeah.
And then the last sort of piece to this is, we ask people about a range of activities they could engage in, going to work, going to the grocery store, going to the movies, a bar, a restaurant, a sporting event, et cetera, et cetera. And really, in the last poll, when we asked this, a majority of Republicans said that each of these things was safe, except for going to a sporting event at an arena.
And even that was at 48%.
That was 49%. So it wasn't like,
right.
So that's one of the things I think, to the extent that, you said the Austin centric, we're in Austin, and to the extent the Twitter universe and the Democratic response versus the Republican response, it's worthwhile to kind of just take a step back and say, regardless of what, let's say, if you're a Democrat, you think about this, whether you think this is ill-advised, whether you think it's too soon, whether you think we're going to be repeating what happened in the summer all over again, it's you kind of have to acknowledge the fact that for most Republicans, this is not the life they're leading during the virus. And this is not their level of perceptions. And not to say that Abbott doesn't represent everybody, but ultimately, he's a Republican politician leading a majority Republican state where the vast majority of Republicans think that it's already safe to do all this stuff, that he's basically putting a rubber stamp on now.
Yeah. And I would point people to, this point that, there's already a set of attitudes about this that are very different among Republicans and among conservatives, that is probably driving a lot of this behavior already, whether they're wearing a mask while they're doing it or not. And I would urge people to go to the Texas Politics Project website and look at our latest poll session and look at, there's a graphic that says, is it safe or unsafe to do each of the following, that's got this list that Josh was referring to. And it really is, to me, and has been since we asked this kind of battery the first time, I guess last poll, 2 polls ago.
2 polls ago. Yeah. In June.
This is the easiest way, I think, to look at a broad range of activities and attitudes and see just where there is a difference between Republicans and Democrats, and independents conveniently kind of snugged up between them in the middle. And again, also, tellingly, in most cases, a little closer to the Republicans than they are the Democrats.
Yeah, which is pretty consistent for most things.
Which is what we think about, independents more generally. So you raise the politics of this. Houston County Judge Linhoth goes on Twitter fairly quickly saying providing a response that I think we will see a lot of later this afternoon, which is that, the governor is now trying to deliver good news and pivot away from the more recent bad news of the power outages last week. There wasn't, to my mind, I don't think there was any mention of the outages other than a brief kind of joke about the cold or something at the beginning.
Hashtag too soon.
And look, this is, this is not something that the governor has not done before. I mean, what he was, he spent some time in the fall pivoting away from COVID to talk about other things during a period in which the pandemic was really at its height. So the politics of this, I think, are interesting as we pivot towards, as we continue to see the governor try to set the agenda in the legislature, in terms of where this positions him and vis-a-vis his fellow Republicans.
When you mentioned the politics of it, there is sort of a weirdo bank shot kind of policy aspect of this, if you want to give the governor a little bit more benefit of the doubt, which I'm somewhat willing to do, because I don't think that, the power outage all of a sudden made, Republicans in the state or the governor more inclined or more, desirous of opening the state up and getting rid of these COVID restrictions. This has been an ongoing piece, but there is something I think in the data that's interesting, and, that I've noticed in terms of the safety battery. We talked about this range of issues, and it's the fact that, after the first measurement we did of it in June, and then we go to October, and now here we are in February, and between October and February, there has been a ton of movement. Ultimately, and just what it seems like is that, it's a little bit stalled out, and that sort of surprised me. Only to the extent that, again, we have vaccines out there. More and more people are getting vaccinated. Presumably, there should be more people who feel safe doing, engaging in these behaviors. And it really hasn't moved yet. And so, to your point earlier about, the signal, what kind of signal does the governor, or what kind of effect does the governor's signal have to people who may be begrudgingly wearing masks? And not because they, acknowledge that there's a threat to themselves or their family members or others, but because, there's some sort of social pressure, it's the law, whatever. Your point being, well, look, he's saying to them, hey, look, I expect you to do this, but it might send a signal to people, but you don't have to.
Right.
I think the same thing might be true here to some extent, right? Which is to say, for Republicans, you've got between a half and 3/4 of which who are basically living their lives normally, doing all these things. And what you could say is, but the thing is, it hasn't moved since October, since before the vaccines get out. So to be out there saying, hey, vaccines are just going to keep coming. We're going to start vaccinating more and more people. We're going to expand the groups. And you know what? I think it's safe to open everything up for business as long, and I leave it to those businesses to operate safely. It's sending a signal, I think, to those people, hey, if you're still feeling reluctant, don't. And since the economy has been the driving underlying factor in a lot of this amongst the Republican response, Yeah,
there's a certain reliance on individualism here, but one might argue that, they kind of tried that before.
Yeah, well.
In the aftermath of the July peak, and what we got was, the more massive peak
I'm not saying
that we were starting to measure. No, I know you're not advocating.
I'm not saying it's
that.
Good policy. I'm just, you know, and I mean, that's the whole, I mean, that's the trouble with all this, right? I mean, the virus, a pandemic is a collective experience. Yeah. And so ultimately it's not about individual responsibility. It's about collective responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, we don't call it private health. We call it public health. Yeah. There's a distinction between the two. I would also note that, the 7-day averages in both deaths and cases have actually increased again, are on the increase again in the last few days.
Well, yeah, that was the thing.
Now that doesn't mean that that's going to continue, but I think, and again, they pivoted to looking at hospitalization rates quite a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, right. But it seems odd to me.
Well, I mean,
not odd. I mean, I know, yeah. I understand the politics. It seems perhaps ill-advised.
Well, I don't even know if it's, to me, I'm not even sure, I don't even necessarily think of it as, I mean, there are the politics of it, but, one of the things I find increasingly, and part of it is what we do for a living, right? So we're looking at attitudes all the time. People come up with their pet theories about other people, i.e., for example, right? Like, well, Republicans don't want to wear masks of Donald Trump. And it's like, yeah, but like 70+% of Republicans are wearing masks. And it's like, and it doesn't match your perception. For something like this for me, I think part of, the benefit of the doubt here and being fair is that, when we talk about Republicans and Democrats, and since we talk about the politics of it, I mean, you're talking about, more, about, let's say 40 to 45% of the voters in the state who share a consistent set of attitudes about the virus. And it tends to minimize the overall concern. It tends to, heed towards, engaging in more behaviors. And it tends to, again, elevate, regaining economic strength over, limiting excess death.
And being less sensitive to risk. And
you can kind of say, and I mean, part of me is say, if you told me, hey, look, 100% of the people who lived in this town feel this way, and this political, this politician went and decided he was going to open up the town, no mask mandates, whatever. I wouldn't say that's, politics per se. I'd say, well, it's a representative government. What are you going to do? And I mean, it's not as though Abbott has, look, I'm not saying it's good policy, but Abbott has been taking arrows for even the lightest restrictions that he has placed. And so, I'm just a little, I don't like the outcome per se myself, because I think the virus is more dangerous than that. And I think the threat is more collective. But I mean, it's hard to look at this and say, he's pandering, because it's not like it's some small group of the Republican coalition that is, living their lives normally. It's 40% who are just living their life as if the virus doesn't exist, according to the polling.
Well, I mean, that's generous of you, I think.
I'm feeling generous today,
I guess. I think that, there's a weird kind of, the politics of it, if, just going on the kind of numbers you're talking about would have then theoretically allowed for saying, yeah, we're going to open everything else up 100%. But the way that works is that we're going to keep the mask mandate in place, and for him to have, had people in the room with masks and saying, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to open up businesses, but the only way this is going to work is if people wear masks. And if we keep it, if we keep in place a bunch of habits that many of you are already following because you are individually responsible. I mean, it's a slight tweak in the message. But as we talk about the politics of this, we've talked about the small share of Republican voters who report not wearing a mask, the increased ability, the increased perceptions of safety and very public and social activity, perceptions of safety, and all of this. I mean, I think you could acknowledge that and probably try to do this in a slightly different, in a slightly different way policy. And I think what it does is it opens the governor up to, I think, the legitimate criticism that he has been overly sensitive to a very, to say, make your point a slightly different way,
please,
to a very small share of Republicans.
Yeah, but
right. I mean, if you're really worried
absolutely.
about, if you're worried about criticism of, like people that don't want to wear a mask, you're just not talking about, you're talking about a small, as our friend Ross Ramsey also often says, a very small but loud group, and the loudness is serving them. I mean, and there's always the sense that the governor's team incorporates, the criticism, in a very front and center way doesn't always feel in proportion to its real potency, frankly. I mean, there was a real emphasis in today's events on saying that, we're gonna urge you to wear masks, and restaurants, can and businesses can ask you to wear a mask. It's a good idea, but hey, no one's getting arrested,
right?
No one's getting fined. No one's putting, their boot on your neck.
No enforcement is basically
right, and that's, it's only barely passes a basic rational sniff test, unless you're thinking in largely political terms, to my mind. From a public health policy perspective, it just doesn't really make any sense.
But let's just pause. That train left the station
a long time ago.
I mean, that's not this is one of those sort of odd things, I think, in politics and policy, where you start to say, like, where you start to play with the counterfactuals, and it's like, and it's fun, right? Yeah. We can say, what would have happened if, but the reality is that, we haven't been following clear public health guidelines, such that they've even existed throughout most of this pandemic.
And cherry picking the data, despite all the talk about science. I mean, for all the talk about how great the vaccine distribution is going, we are still, as of this morning, I believe, 49th out of. In the measurement that counts.
In the measurement that counts,
which is the share of the population that are getting vaccines. We're at 49th, and forgive me if we slipped or if we gain some ground overnight, which as happens in these ratings sometimes, and we're maybe 47th or 48th.
Right, but not necessarily leading the nation in, the race to combat COVID, right, and the justification for reopening.
Again, the point being, if that's your rationale, is that we're doing so well, it's not.
Well, see, but this is the thing, and I'll just, I know that there's the politics of this, which is to say that we're doing so well no matter what. But the reality is, to go back, about the public health train that left the station, is that the state's approach to this has basically been to bear it.
Yeah.
I mean, once basically Abbott passed, control of the response to the local governments, and then didn't like their response, and then opened things up in the summer, and we know what happened. I mean, the basic response has been, we're going to wait till we get vaccines. We're going to try to keep people going to work, which is important, right? We're going to try to keep the economy going. And I think, this is just a further example of that. I mean, Abbott's kind of been ahead of the public health data and the actual, facts on the ground, it seems, throughout this. And this is really no different. I mean, the argument is, well, look, by July, everyone will have access to a vaccine, so we can open up now. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, and I also know, and I also think, you have to put this in, in the general context that Judge Hidalgo was trying to raise, but I think I would do it a little differently. I'm in a different position than the Harris County judge
for now.
But I mean, I do think, this is signaling, and everybody wants to talk about or not everybody. There's lots of people that leap immediately to the whole, Greg Abbott wants to run for president and all this. Right. And I'm just setting that aside yet again for the moment. But I do think that if you look at the pandemic and you look at the power outages and the general sense, not just the power outages, but the general sense that, the infrastructure, collapsed in a lot of parts of the state and came close to a catastrophic collapse in the aftermath, in conjunction with what we've seen in the pandemic, and the response to the pandemic, is that there is a real overall dissonance between what we've seen in Texas in the last year, but in particularly in the last few months, say the last, 2 months of time or 3 months, if we go back to December, that is a real problem for core Republican ownership of the quote unquote Texas model and the central general election appeal that Republicans have relied on for the duration of their hegemony in the state, which is, Texas is open for business. We talked, I think the last podcast we did was after the state of the state address before the power, the power outages. And the clearly what the governor was trying to convey there was that we're kind of past this pandemic thing. It's been tough. But Texas is open for business, and, slides of companies coming to Texas. The 1-2 of the pandemic and the power outages is a real problem for that image and that argument. And, the rest of the country, including other states competing with Texas for business, are not being shy about noting that. And so, I think this is a way of, returning to the brand that for the state and for the Republican Party and for the party running the state, that they've worked very hard to establish. And I think we're gonna see more of that. And that, and that doesn't bode well for public policy. I mean, in the way that it's being implemented.
I think, what you raise is, I think, one of the central questions, kind of looking at the sort of this next 2-year stretch between the last election and the next one. Right.
Yeah.
And it's this, and I think, I would expand it even further to say, which is, it's the state's response to COVID. We'll see how the continued vaccine distribution goes and the efficiency and of that. The power grid failure is one thing, but, I think what some people have pointed out about COVID and its impact is it's really emphasized other areas in the infrastructure broadly understood that are lacking. Yeah. Right. And so, I think, on the left, Democrats are licking their chops saying, finally, voters are going to realize that Republicans are mismanaging the state. But the thing that we always find, and, this is something I think I tell to a lot of out-of-state visitors often, I get some version of a question, this is crazy, that is crazy, this is crazy. Why do Texans put up with it? And this is usually someone from New York or somewhere else. And, my basic response is, well, because this is the government that they want. And we can see that both in, questions specifically asking about the policies that they're talking about. But further, your point is the Texas model, which is basically low taxes, low services state. And, we ask a question about that regularly. We don't see a lot of movement on it. In general, a good share of people think that the way that Texas does things does it well. And I increasingly think that part of what that means is that they don't have necessarily high expectations for a lot of this stuff. Now, where the problem comes in is, as you pointed out, in two ways, which is in a comparative sense. I think within Texas, I'm not sure that any of this necessarily hurts Abbott in his position. We'll see. It could eventually accumulate, but it hasn't yet. I think, the out-of-state message is harder, right? When you're basically saying, come to Texas for business, but our power grid went down and we have no way to fix it immediately, or something like that.
Well, that's the point. Yeah.
That's the problem. And then further, then the question becomes, okay, you're worried about running for president, and there's Ron DeSantis and there's other people, and they're saying, hey, aren't you the state that can't give your people power and water?
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. So that's the point.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
And we will see, how that, how it plays internally. I think you're right. I think that, there's, remains to be seen what the internal reaction will be and whether these things can all be put together. But I guess my point is, this kind of move directs attention internally away from all that. Mm-hmm. Right.
Definitely.
And we'll see, and we'll see if they can continue the momentum on that. Lots of other stuff in the poll. We'll get back to that next week. Watch the Texas Tribune on Wednesday for release of the final tranche of results. Go to the Texas Tribune website to see Ross Ramsey's write-ups of the poll. We've begun slow rolling out the data and some of the graphics for this. For those of you that teach or give presentations, you'll find all that stuff on our website, and we'll have much more kind of drill down into that over the next couple weeks, including on next week's podcast. So Jim Henson, Josh Blank, thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our crew at the College of Liberal Arts and Liberal Arts Development Studio at UT Austin. Thanks to you for listening. Be safe. Now we have to say, stay warm. Hope your utilities stay on, and we'll talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.